Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back even further, far beyond the medieval castles and onion tests, to a world of desert heat, moonlit palaces, and the slow hum of river reeds along the Nile. Egypt, land of gods, gold, and gossip. Tonight's story isn't about pyramids or mummies, though. It's about something far more complicated, royal harems. The word itself has been romanticized to exhaustion, turned into a fantasy of silk cushions and languid beauty. But the real thing, as usual, was both duller and darker. Less about pleasure, and more about politics. Less a paradise, more a very well-decorated cage. So, take a deep breath. Let the torches burn low. And imagine yourself inside a palace of the New Kingdom, sometime around 1300 BCE. The air is heavy with incense, a smell somewhere between honey and death. And behind the carved stone walls, a small army of women, servants, guards, and scribes move quietly through corridors designed to be unseen. That was the royal harem, the place where Egypt hid its most delicate secrets. The word harem comes from an Arabic root meaning forbidden or sacred. In ancient Egypt, the concept existed long before Islam, though the later term stuck. Every pharaoh kept what official scribes politely called the house of the royal children, which was a poetic way of saying a controlled environment for royal wives, concubines, and potential heirs. It was, technically, both a family home and a political factory, because that's what harems really were, engines of dynasty. Every alliance, every child, every whisper mattered. The wrong rumor could kill you. The wrong son could end a kingdom. And because of course they were human, not statues, there was gossip, there was jealousy, there was scheming that could put palace politics to shame. If you ever picture Cleopatra lounging in a bath of milk, imagine instead a younger, more anxious woman, surrounded by attendants, wondering if the next concubine will bear the son that replaces hers. That's the true rhythm of the royal harem: anxiety, perfume, and power disguised as luxury. Pharaohs, naturally, had no intention of staying faithful. They were living gods. Fidelity was for mortals. Marriage, for them, was a diplomatic sport. The great royal wife, the chief queen, was the official, the figure carved on temple walls, the mother of legitimate heirs. But beyond her, the pharaoh maintained a hierarchy of secondary wives, concubines, and favorites. Each category had its privileges, and each came with its own tiny, fragrant slice of paranoia. Some women were foreign princesses, offerings from neighboring kingdoms meant to seal treaties. Imagine a young girl from Babylon, hardly 12 years old, shipped upriver to live among strangers who worshipped cats and painted their gods blue. She might never see her homeland again, but her marriage could keep her father's army away from Egypt's borders. Her body was a border. Others were local women, sometimes chosen from noble families, occasionally from obscurity. Their job was to provide the pharaoh with entertainment, heirs, or sometimes just company, because even a living god, it seems, got lonely. And in a rare display of honesty, Egyptian poetry sometimes hints at affection, tiny fragments of tenderness in a system that otherwise treated women like ceremonial property. A few pharaohs actually seemed to like their wives, or at least, they liked one more than the others, which caused endless problems. Let's drift for a moment into the harem of Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Great, partly because he built more statues of himself than anyone else, and partly because nobody dared call him otherwise. Ramses had, by most counts, around 8 official wives, dozens of secondary wives, and more than 100 children. It's said that by the end of his reign, you could throw a brick in Thebes and hit one of his descendants. But his harem wasn't chaos. It was meticulously organized. Each woman had her own quarters, servants, and attendants. There were scribes who kept track of who received what gifts, who had which child, and whose turn it was to attend royal ceremonies. You might imagine a wild, sensual free-for-all, but in truth, it ran more like a tax office. Every favor was logged, every robe inventoried. The women of the harem spent their days in a peculiar mixture of boredom and ceremony. They practiced music, embroidery, dance. They attended religious festivals when permitted. They bathed obsessively. Cleanliness was status. And they waited, because the only thing more powerful than being chosen by the pharaoh was being chosen again. It wasn't all perfume and luxury, though. For every beloved queen, there was a forgotten concubine, and for every smiling attendant, there was a woman quietly aging behind a curtain, waiting for a visit that never came. Imagine hundreds of women, living in a sealed-off world, their lives revolving around a single man they barely saw. It was like a celestial orbit that kept most planets cold and distant. The hierarchy was brutal. At the top sat the great royal wife, often a woman of noble birth, trained from childhood to embody elegance and piety. Below her, the lesser wives. Then the concubines, beautiful, yes, but expendable. And finally, the servants, invisible women who washed, dressed, and perfumed the others. Some were allowed to bear children, others were forbidden. Because in Egypt, even motherhood was political. A child born to the wrong woman could throw the royal line into chaos. So harem life was full of carefully controlled fertility, something that would have made the medieval urine testers feel right at home. And yet, despite the constraints, the harem was also a place of quiet female power. The great royal wife often acted as a sort of deputy pharaoh, managing religious ceremonies, presiding over court rituals, even advising on diplomacy. Some women wielded more influence from behind silk screens than generals did on the battlefield. One of the most fascinating examples was Tai, wife of Amenhotep III and mother of Akhenaten, the pharaoh who tried to turn Egypt monotheistic. Tai wasn't royal by birth. She came from a noble but not divine family, yet she managed to rise higher than almost any queen before her. Her intelligence was legendary, her political instincts razor-sharp. Foreign kings wrote directly to her, addressing her as an equal, a shocking thing in a world that barely admitted women existed outside childbirth. And within the harem, she ruled like a quiet son. Her word was law. Even her husband deferred to her in letters, calling her the mistress of the two lands. It's almost comforting, in a darkly amusing way, to think that even the god king of Egypt had to answer to his wife. But not every harem stayed peaceful. Some became the stage for bloodier dramas, the kind whispered about in temple corridors and never officially written down. The most infamous was the harem conspiracy under Ramses III. By then, Egypt was wobbling. The empire was rich in memory, poor in everything else. Ramses III still claimed divine power, but the treasury was leaking, the priests were mutinous, and the women of his household were restless. One of his secondary wives, Tai, not the same one. Apparently Egypt had only about 4 names in circulation, decided her son deserved the throne more than the official A. So, in a plan that must have seemed brilliant after too much wine, she and several officials conspired to assassinate the pharaoh. They recruited servants, guards, and even magicians, because if you're going to overthrow a living god, you might as well do it with style. Papyrus records found later describe writings of magic and wax figures used to curse Ramses. It reads like a crime novel written by someone who believed dolls could kill. The plot failed spectacularly. Ramses III was wounded, possibly killed. The evidence is still debated, but the conspirators were caught. The trials that followed were grim and oddly bureaucratic. Judges sat in judgment over women and eunuchs who had once lived in perfumed chambers, now stripped and bound. Some were executed, others forced to commit suicide. Even a few judges were punished for consorting with the accused, because apparently, old habits die hard. If you ever need a reminder that harems weren't dreamy fantasies but pressure cookers of jealousy and ambition, that story will do it. Still, it's worth remembering that most harem life wasn't assassination and magic wax dolls. Most of it was routine, quiet, a daily rhythm of bathing, grooming, small talk, and embroidery. A kind of domestic theater performed for no audience. The women were expected to stay beautiful, to entertain when summoned, to vanish when not. The entire world existed behind walls meant to protect them, and to keep them invisible. There's a haunting irony in how well that system worked. For all the power these women indirectly held, history rarely recorded their names. Their faces on tomb walls, their titles carved beside the pharaohs, beloved of the king, sweet of voice, ornament of the palace. But their thoughts, their real lives, drifted away like perfume in the desert air. And then there was the architecture of it all. The harem wasn't just a cluster of bedrooms. It was an entire complex, gardens, workshops, granaries, and temples. There were musicians, physicians, cooks, and guards, mostly eunuchs. because the job description was very clear. The women lived surrounded by luxury, but also surveillance. Every doorway had a watcher. Every letter had to be approved. Freedom was a rumor. Even gifts from the Pharaoh were double-edged. A necklace could mean favor. It could also mean you were being sent to a distant villa, a polite form of exile. And yet, some women managed to play the long game brilliantly. They befriended priests, adopted foreign customs, and positioned their sons as likely heirs. Behind the embroidered curtains, Egypt's future was being negotiated with smiles and scented oil. Let's drift, now, to the late Ptolemaic period, the age of Cleopatra. Not the Shakespearean temptress, but the real one, Cleopatra VII, last of her line, multilingual scholar, and survivor of generations raised in a royal harem system. By her time, the Egyptian harem had blended with Greek traditions. The queens were no longer confined in hidden palaces. They appeared in public, issued decrees, spoke at court. But the essence of the old harem, the mix of intimacy and danger, never vanished. Cleopatra's own childhood was steeped in it. Her family's palace in Alexandria was, effectively, a gilded maze of rival siblings, spies, and half-siblings who kept mysteriously dying. It's almost poetic that Cleopatra herself turned the harem's internal politics outward, seducing empires instead of princes. What her foremothers did in whispers, she did in public. And when she finally died, dramatically, of course, she took with her the last flicker of the royal harem's strange, perfumed power. If you think about it, harems were never really about lust. They were about control. They were palaces built to contain female power. And ironically, they became its breeding ground. Inside those walls, women learned diplomacy, manipulation, and endurance. They learned how to survive gods and kings. And that's the quiet truth of the royal harem. It was less a pleasure house than a pressure chamber, a place where love, ambition, and fear all wore the same perfume. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine those women, not the mythic beauties of paintings, but real people, waiting in candlelight, listening to the river outside, wondering which version of themselves would survive by morning, mother, exile, queen, or footnote. Because in Egypt, even silence had politics.